Good morning. Happy Tuesday to you. It is a gray and dreary and going to be drizzly Tuesday out there here in central Illinois. So if you're around here, you'll want your tea today. And providentially, it's Tuesday Tea-ology. So here we are, ready to warm your throat with the tea and warm your heart and get your mind fired up with the theology, Lord willing. So, we continue to look at the attributes of God. And we're coming into an area where we are going to be examining some attributes that show God's infinity in various relations. uh, that that coming to the subject of space, that God is unlimited, He is infinite, He is sovereign over all space. The subject of time, that God is sovereign over time and not limited by it. His knowledge is not limited by anything that has been made, and so on. So before we get into these specific areas, I want to talk about this concept of God's infinity in general. And it's hard to know whether to talk about God's infinity as a general concept, uh, because it's hard to find examples that don't fall into some category. If I say God is infinite, and you say, what do I mean? I could talk about how He's infinite relative to space, or infinite relative to time, or infinite relative to power, or so on. But talking about infinity in the abstract, on the other hand, is very difficult because it's abstract. But at the same time, I think it is good to get a little grounding on just this idea of God as infinite, and what that means before we get into specifics of sort of what does that look like. And so that is where we will theologize for a moment. The infinity of God. God is not limited. That's what the word infinite means. If you're taking it apart, it's got that in prefix and then finite, and to be finite is to be limited, and God is not limited. And that is, once again, we are looking at a basic distinction of God being God, distinction between God and creatures. All creatures are limited. Creatures vary in their powers and abilities and intelligence and understanding and so on. The human being is able to do many things that an opossum cannot. And the opossum is in many powers superior to a tree or something like that. And so on. So you could trace sort of in various aspects who is less limited, whose strength or intelligence or discernment or so on is greater. But all creatures are limited. And in comparison to them, there is this utter break that God is not limited. And that is a huge concept. We can't wrap our minds around it because our minds are limited. And so we are inherently contemplating, when we contemplate God, we are contemplating someone who is beyond us and beyond our ability to comprehend. We talked about how God is incomprehensible, and this is really just extending that idea. God being incomprehensible is to say we can't fully wrap our minds around God. God's infinity is to say we can't even really know what we're saying when we say this, but that it's not just our minds, it's existence as a whole. God cannot be limited. And so he is utterly different from everything he has made. Let's go to a verse from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 18. To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? And the implied answer is no one. You cannot liken God to anyone. God is incomparable. That's in some ways saying the same thing as infinite. Infinite says by faith we profess that there are no limits. Incomparable says, kind of taking this in the way of understanding. You can't compare anything to God. He is beyond compare. This concept, to kind of describe it a little more, I have theologian Herman Bavinck coming to us from 100 and some years ago. He says, infinity is not a negative but a positive concept. So try to grasp that, because again the word is negative, infinite, not finite. But he's saying it's not a negative but a positive concept. It means not that God has no distinct being of his own, but that he is not limited by anything finite and creaturely. So we could get a wrong idea in saying God is infinite, that, oh, well, then there's nothing really we can say about him. And if ever anyone tries to say something about God, we'll say, yeah, but you're limiting God. No, that's not it. For example, when we say that God is holy, God is just, God is loving, we are by definition ruling out some things. We're saying God is not unholy, God is not unjust, God is not unloving, and so on. But we're not limiting God. We are understanding God's character as God has conveyed it. So it's not saying that God is this indefinite fuzzy reality that we can't say anything about. It's saying that we can't put creaturely limitations upon God, because God is not a creature. God is the creator. God is utterly beyond. And there are attempts over and over again to put limits upon God. And that comes from, strangely, our desire to fit him into our minds, or make certain comparisons that we shouldn't make with creatures. Well, let's come back to that, because we want to focus for a few minutes on this verse and try to see where the rubber hits the road. What does this concept of God's infinity mean in terms of our relationship with Him, in terms of this life that we are living? Where does the infinity of God come in? So you go to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 18. To whom will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? And what's the setting of that verse? Well, this is really wonderfully encouraging. It is about the vastness of God, who is the Savior of his people. So, verse 11, he will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. So, the vastness of God and his strength is a part of recognizing, and this is our God. If you have trusted in Jesus Christ, if you're part of the people of God, this is your God, who is so strong, and he is incomparable. He is infinite. So, verse 12, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, and closed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in balance? So that is the greatness of God's work, and no one can measure God's work. If you can't measure God's work, although there is a measurement to these things, if you could measure them, but if even measuring God's work is beyond you, think of the God who is beyond and has created these things. Verse 13, who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel? God's understanding is beyond. Whom did he consult? Who showed him understanding? Verse 14. Compared to God, the nations are like a drop in the bucket, verse 15, and a couple verses beyond that, it established that thought. And so when you come to verse 18, to whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? It's in the context of saying God is the redeemer of his people, and he is incomparable when you look at all the things he has made. So no creaturely limitations that we would want to put on God. And then this is specifically set up against the idolatry of the nations. So specifically, you can't contrast God, compare God with an idol, things that are made by man. And so in the times, in the immediate context, idolatry was rampant. And so, in the first place, your idols are limited simply because they are idols. They are in fact creatures themselves, creatures of human hands, human creations, as it were. Not living creatures; they're dead creatures, but creations. And in the second place, the gods that they purportedly represent, or are connected with, or in some way contain, or make a home for, these gods tended to be limited. They had domains of sorts. They had areas where they were particularly powerful, maybe, and areas where it'd be some other god's domain. So the whole concept of polytheism really is grounded in the idea of gods as limited. And Israel bringing this revelation, rediscovery of monotheism, is in comparison declaring the one true and infinite God. The idols can't save, they are ineffective, but God is able to care for his people, and to gather them, to guide them. And so you come to the end of Isaiah chapter 40, and those words that may be familiar to you. Have you not known, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary, and his understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. It is the God who carries his people and gives them strength, who is himself beyond limits, and therefore our source for the greatest hope and confidence. In the old days, in times past, they made idols and had false gods who were limited. And I'm afraid that tendency stays in the human heart. There is a sinful desire to have a limited God. Sometimes, practically, it comes because we want to be autonomous. We want to be our own gods. And so in your mind, you put limits on God. Other times, there are mistakes, and I don't want to get into people's motives in a way that's unhealthy or unhelpful, but it is tragic, even when well-meaning Christian thinkers just because they can't wrap their minds around God's infinity, uh, try to uh, revise the teaching of the Christian faith and put limits on God. How much better, how good and blessed it is to acknowledge the greatness of the unlimited and incomparable God, and to find in there the supreme strength and encouragement which comes from recognizing that God is beyond and cannot be limited. That the God who is beyond all comparison is the God who shelters his people, who gives strength to the weary, who lifts up those who are in need and carries them, who is able to put right all that is wrong in this world, and who can be relied upon in any and every circumstance. In his wisdom and power, his goodness and eternal uh, understanding, to know the way forward and to bring his people safely home. May you be strengthened as you reflect upon and rejoice in the infinite God today. The Lord bless you.